And now, a passage from California, its history and romance, from Chapter 7, The Bear Flag Republic. Unique in the history of the world is the true story of the Bear Flag Republic in California. From June 14, 1846 until the 9th day of the succeeding month of July, a period of 26 days, there existed in California what was, to all intents and purposes, a separate and distinct nation, with a republican form of government and a flag of its own, emblazoned with a lone star and a painted image of a grizzly bear. The official name of the government was the Republic of California, but it is popularly known as the Bear Flag Republic. The new nation was established by an armed force consisting of 24 men, and the entire history of the affair, short but vivid as it is, probably stands without parallel. There is no chapter in the history of California that has a more familiar sound to the ear than the chapter of this Bear Flag Republic, yet the truth concerning it, not to speak of its intensely interesting details, is only vaguely familiar to most people. There is a great deal of misinformation extant in the minds of all except careful students and the historians themselves concerning a good deal that appertains to the history of California, including both the stirring chronicles of the Argonauts and the missions, but it is when we come to the chronicle of the Bear Flag Republic that we find perhaps not so much misinformation as the lack of information altogether. Everybody who lives in California and those who come to visit it, as well as those who read of it at a distance, have heard and know that there was once an uprising in which some Americans took part by raising a bear flag at Sonoma, following which there was more or less fighting with the native Californians, but that is about as far as the general information goes. Moreover, it is found that among those who presume to be informed intelligently and as fully as may be on this famous episode in California's history, that there is considerable dispute as to the real facts. The subject has been the theme of endless controversies. The descendants of the Mexicans, who were known as Californians at the time of the Bear Flag Republic, say that the coup was merely a foray on the part of crude and irresponsible ruffians who had no high motive in view, and who accomplish nothing by actions which they can call by no better name than depredations. On the other hand, the descendants of the early American settlers claim a high place in history for the Bear Flag Republic, and they celebrate each recurring anniversary of its establishment with much oratory, music, and the firing of military salutes. The purpose of this chapter in the present work is to tell the story as it occurred, without prejudice one way or the other, and to equip the reader with a clear and lucid understanding of this little, yet colorful, and in some ways really important epoch in California's history. The episode of the Bear Flag Republic occurred in the summer of the year 1846, and it is essential in advance that conditions in California as they existed at that time be clearly understood. The dawn of the year 1846 found California still a province of the Republic of Mexico, with a white population of about 10,000 souls all told. Included in this population, there had come to be a considerable sprinkling of Americans who were engaged in agricultural pursuits, lumbering, and various kinds of trading. It is to be remembered that gold had not yet been discovered, except as note may be taken of the unimportant discoveries made in the South. Nor was there then, in the minds of the people, any thought whatever of the possibilities of the existence of gold. The Americans who had drifted in from the States came sometimes as sailors deserting their ships in the lure of the country, or they were men who had crossed the plains and the mountains to the east and the north merely in search of undiscovered regions. But however it was that they came, they were enamored of California and had neither thought nor desire to abandon it. At this time, the affairs of California as a Mexican province were in a very deplorable condition indeed. Don Pio Pico was the civil governor with his residence near Los Angeles. He seemed to have avoided Monterrey, which was still the capital of the province, as it had been from the first settlement in 1769. The military authority was vested in Don Jose Castro, who held power under the title of Comandante General, his rank in the army being Lieutenant Colonel of Cavalry. These two men were constantly at rivalry, scarcely ever agreeing upon questions of government or authority, and constantly squabbling over a division of an exchequer which was usually little better than impoverished. Pico, after the secularization and spoliation of the mission establishments and estates, found himself with no other means of easy revenues, while Castro, as the head of the military establishments of the province, would have found himself put to his wits' end to mobilize an army consisting of more than 100 men. It was plain to the Californians, as well as to the Americans and everybody else who were in the province, that the Republic of Mexico was on its last legs. At least as far as holding possession of California was concerned, both Pico and Castro appealed in vain, time after time, to the home government to strengthen their hands. It became at last fully apparent that Mexico was to lose California. For a time, Governor Pico and others indulged themselves in the vain hope that they might be able to set up an independent government with themselves at its head. Apparently, however, these hopes were soon abandoned, and they settled down to the belief that either England, France, or the United States would ultimately secure possession of California. Of these three possibilities, all regarded as evil by the Californians, American domination was the most distasteful alternative. There were many who would have welcomed the power of France, but the majority seemed to stand most in favor of England. Among these was Pico. Every day the air was filled with rumors, and the people were constantly in a state of nervous excitement and discontent. That England was actively engaged with clear-cut and positive plans for the acquisition of California there was ample information, despite the fact that the Monroe Doctrine had been repeatedly reaffirmed. British warships continually hovered along the California coast, waiting for an opening and an opportunity to strike. To what extent France actively engaged in these movements is not quite clear. Well aware of everything that was going on, the government of the United States was determined to acquire California when the time came for it to pass from the possession of Mexico. To this end, it stationed at Monterey a very able, cautious, and courageous diplomatic agent in the person of Thomas O. Larkin, and there appears also to be no doubt that the appearance in California of Captain John C. Fremont, who was then an officer in the Army attached to the Department of Topographical Engineers, was for a deeper purpose than that announced, which was that he had been sent out to survey the Rocky Mountain country and the Pacific coast in the interests of travel and immigration. There was at least one point on which Pico, Castro, and all the Californians of Spanish-Mexican origin agreed, and that was an intense distrust and hatred of Americans. So, in the midst of all this turmoil, dissension, and uncertainty, the American population of California found itself very disagreeably bestowed. The American settlers soon found that they could not look to the government of the United States to assist them in their aspirations to secure control of California. If they applied to the commander of an American warship that happened to be at Monterey, San Francisco, or any other port, they were invariably told that no assistance could be rendered to them for the reason that Mexico and the United States were at peace. But it appears to be quite clear that the Americans were constantly in touch with Fremont and his little party of pathfinders, and that they never failed of a sympathetic audience in that quarter. Nearly all the Americans living in California in the beginning of the year 1846 were located in the section of country adjacent to the Bay of San Francisco. At the little town of Sonoma, in the lovely Valley of the Seven Moons, 46 miles north of San Francisco, or Yerba Buena, as it was then called, was located what had been, for a long time, the only really effective Mexican military garrison in the province of California. The garrison was in command of General Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo. For several years, General Vallejo had kept the garrison intact mainly through his own energies and from the proceeds of his private purse. He had at times some well-organized companies of soldiers. In the summer of 1846, General Vallejo's garrison had shrunk to a mere handful of men. Still, he was regarded as the representative of the military power of Mexico, and his post was looked upon as a fortress. Just before dawn, June 14, 1846, Vallejo was rudely awakened from his peaceful slumbers, and together with his household and his official staff, was placed under arrest by a party of American settlers who announced that they had established, in connection with others of their fellow citizens of the United States, an independent government based on Republican principles. This party of Americans consisted of 24 men under the leadership of Captain Ezekiel Merritt. A man named William B. Ide and a dentist named Semple appeared to be Merritt's chief advisors and the next in command. In the party was also the famous Kit Carson, who had come to California as a member of Captain Fremont's company. It appears that General Vallejo took the situation philosophically and invited his captors to make themselves free with the hospitality of his house. A few hours afterward, General Vallejo, his brother Captain Salvador Vallejo, and Lieutenant Colonel Victor Proudhon were taken under guard on General Vallejo's own horses and imprisoned in Sutter's Fort at Sacramento. The prisoners having been safely forwarded, the American invaders then gathered in the plaza of Sonoma, lowered the Mexican flag from the lofty staff on which it there was flying, and raised the bear flag amid salvos of cheers. The capture of Sonoma and the raising of the bear flag were acts probably not exactly premeditated. They were led up to by a rather stirring incident which must be related in order to get the proper bearing on the entire matter. A few days before the capture of Sonoma, General Castro, accompanied by Lieutenant Jose Maria Alviso and Lieutenant Francisco Arce, and a party of about 12 men, set out from Monterrey to Sonoma, issuing anti-American proclamations as they went. Castro's purpose in going to Sonoma was to secure from General Vallejo as much material assistance in his campaign as was possible. He wanted money, arms, munitions of war, and horses. It is not clear what amount of success he had, but it is certain that he had secured a number of horses from Vallejo and contrabanded whatever animals were in possession of the Franciscan fathers at the mission. Castro then immediately returned to Monterrey, breathing fire at every mile, and at once proceeded to perfect his military forces for the campaign which had for its object the expulsion of all Americans from California territory. It is also apparent that Castro had determined while he was at it to put Pio Pico out of business and thus kill two birds with one stone. The Americans were now thoroughly alarmed, as they had every right to be, and a party of them went over to visit Fremont and to advise with him in his camp on the American River. The visitors told Captain Fremont of the dire straits they felt themselves to be in. Fremont replied by saying that he was an officer of the United States Army and could not personally interfere, but he advised the Americans to do everything in their power to defend themselves. He went so far as to say that any of his men who were willing to take a hand in matters as they then stood were at liberty to do so. Several of Fremont's men, including Kit Carson, promptly took advantage of the privilege thus granted and accompanied the American settlers as they sallied forth to look after their own interests. The party soon got word of Alviso and Arce, who were on their way from Sonoma with the horses. Under the leadership of Ezekiel Merritt, the Americans surprised Alviso and his party early on the morning of June 10th, and without a fight captured the Californians and seized their arms and animals. After an interchange of views, not unlikely coupled with threats on the part of Merritt, the Californians were permitted to resume their journey, but were required to relinquish the horses. Alviso and his men hurried to San Jose and reported the matter to Castro's military aides. This act on the part of the Americans was regarded by Castro as the precursor of an invasion. It doubtless determined him to commence operations against the offensive Americans. In the meantime, Merritt with his spoils returned to Fremont's camp, where plans were immediately formed for the attack on Sonoma, which followed, as already shown, on June 14th. With the capture of Castro's horses, which was an overt act, the die was cast, and the Americans now determined to go to the end of the road. Sonoma was naturally in their minds, whether it be true or not that it had been in their minds before, and the capture of that garrison with the raising of the Bear Flag followed the initial raid as a natural sequence. The story of the Bear Flag itself is not lacking in a certain quaint, half-humorous, yet romantic interest. Neither was it without a dramatic side. No sooner had the detachment of captors left for Sutter's Fort with General Vallejo and the other prisoners than the Mexican colors were hauled down by ready hands from the flagpole in the old plaza. The problem of supplying a new flag with which to supplant the Mexican ensign then faced the Americans. In that party was a man named William L. Todd, who seemed to know something about handling a paintbrush, and he was chosen to be the artist of the flag. It was unanimously agreed that no one had any authority to raise the stars and stripes, and that if anyone did so, he would be seriously amenable to the United States government. But it was the desire of everyone present that a flag as near like the American flag as possible be adopted. It also seemed to be the consensus of opinion that a drawing of a grizzly bear be placed on the flag as being eloquent of the fighting qualities with which the new republic considered itself equipped. As there has been considerable controversy and dispute concerning this flag, it is obviously proper to give the statement of the man who made the flag. He, if anyone, ought to know all about it. Mr. Todd published in June 1872 the following. At a company meeting, it was determined that we should raise a flag, and it should be a bear en passant with one star. One of the ladies at the garrison gave us a piece of brown domestic, and Mrs. Captain John Sears gave us some stripes of red flannel about 4 inches wide. The domestic was new, but the flannel was said to have been part of a petticoat worn by Mrs. Sears across the mountains. For a corroboration of these facts, I refer to G.P. Swift and Pat McChristian. I took a pen and with ink drew the outlines of the bear and star upon the white cotton cloth. Linseed oil and Venetian red were found in the garrison, and I painted the bear and star. To the best of my recollection, Peter Storm was asked to paint it, but he declined. And as no other person would undertake to do it, I did it. But Mr. Storm, with several others, assisted in getting the material, and I believe mixed the paint. Underneath the bear and star were printed with a pen the words California Republic in Roman letters. In painting the words, I first lined out the letters with a pen, leaving out the letter I and putting C where I should have been, and afterwards the I over the C. It was made with ink, and as we had nothing to remove the marks of the false letters, it now remains so on the flag. There were at least two other bear flags in existence, but there can be no doubt that this one was described by William L. Todd, and which was raised at Sonoma June 14, 1846, was the original ensign. 4 days later, William B. Ide, who appears to have been selected for the leadership to succeed Ezekiel Merritt, issued and signed the following proclamation. A proclamation to all persons and citizens of the District of Sonoma, requesting them to remain at peace and follow their rightful occupations without fear of molestation. The commander-in-chief of the troops assembled at the fortress of Sonoma gives this inviolable pledge to all persons in California not found under arms, that they shall not be disturbed in their persons, their property, or social relation, one with another by men under his command. He also solemnly declares his object to be, first, to defend himself and companions in arms who were invited to this country by a promise of lands on which to settle themselves and families, who were also promised a Republican government when, having arrived in California, they were denied the privilege of buying or renting lands of their friends, who instead of being allowed to participate in or being protected by a Republican government, were oppressed by a military despotism, who were even then threatened by a proclamation by the chief officers of the aforesaid despotism with extermination if they should not depart out of the country, leaving all their property, arms, and beasts of burden, and thus deprived of their means of flight or defense, were to be driven through deserts inhabited by hostile Indians to certain destruction. To overthrow a government which has seized upon the property of the missions for its individual aggrandizement, which has ruined and shamefully oppressed the laboring people of California by enormous exactions on goods imported into the country, is the determined purpose of the brave men who are associated under my command. I also solemnly declare my object, in the second place, to be to invite all peaceable and good citizens of California who are friendly to the maintenance of good order and equal rights. And I do hereby invite them to repair to my camp at Sonoma without delay, to assist us in establishing and perpetuating a Republican government, which shall secure to all civil and religious liberty, which shall encourage virtue and literature, which shall leave unshackled by fetters agriculture, commerce, and manufactures. I further declare that I rely upon the rectitude of our intentions, the favor of heaven, and the bravery of those who are bound and associated with me by the principles of self-preservation, by the love of truth, and the hatred of tyranny, for my hopes of success. I furthermore declare that I believe that a government to be prosperous and happy must originate with the people who are friendly to its existence, that the citizens are its guardians, the officers its servants, its glory, its reward. No one who reads this remarkable document can fail to believe that the slurs cast upon the leaders of the Bear Flag Republic by California's most eminent and most voluminous historian are ill-founded and unjust. If the Bear Flag Republic had produced nothing more than this magnificent contribution to the literature of human rights, as written by William B. Ide, the affair has had sufficient excuse for even so brief an existence. The document marked Ide as a remarkable man, which he undoubtedly was, a man who, like Caesar, according to Miles Standish, could both write and fight, and at each was equally skillful. If you enjoy the content of High Americana, please consider supporting the channel, donating to Patreon linked below. Thank you very much.